Good afternoon, and welcome to the last panel for the Transatlantic Symposium on Slavery. My name is Annette Gordon-Reed from Harvard University, and I'm going to moderate the panel on public memory and oral history. This is going to be a conversation, this is a round table, where we will talk about, our panelists will talk about their experiences with this. And we'll do that for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions from all of you. This is such an important topic. I mean, there are so many people who are in history who were not allowed to make records, who could not tell their stories in ways that historians typically find stories in papers and letters and so forth. And oral history and public memory are those kinds of ways that we get into talking about history and how individual people make history and are a part of history. So to do this, we have some wonderful panelists, Andrew Davenport, Justin Reid, and Professor Alan Rice. And I'm going to call them forward to talk a little bit about their experiences. And once they are finished, then we will start the general discussion. So we will start with Andrew Davenport, who is the public historian at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, following some wonderful people in that particular role. He's a manager of Monticello's Getting Word project, which is all about oral history and memory and bringing forth stories that had not been told before. He's a PhD candidate in history at Georgetown and is a researcher and oral historian at the Georgetown Slavery Archive. So Andrew, welcome.
Thanks so much, Professor Gordon-Reed, and it's such a pleasure to be with you and Justin and Alan. As Professor Gordon-Reed mentioned, I am Andrew Davenport. I'm Monticello's public historian and the manager of the Getting Word African American Oral History Project. Getting Word is one of the signature projects of the International Center for Jefferson Studies and Monticello, and it was begun in 1993 by founders Lucia Stanton, Dr. Diane Swan Wright, and Ohio consultant Beverly Gray. And the project aims to record and interpret the oral histories of descendants of people enslaved by Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. To date, Getting Word has conducted oral histories with 226 people, which has helped to fundamentally transform interpretation of Black life at Monticello and beyond. And through conversations with Andrew O'Shaughnessy and our colleague Nia Bates, I began to see and theorize that Getting Word, which was begun as an archive of slavery, is actually more about an archive of freedom, where the history and diaspora of thousands of people enslaved at Monticello, where the history of thousands of descendants of people enslaved at Monticello can be glimpsed. Mm-hmm. So seeing through the lens of this particular population, we can see this archive of freedom in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We'll talk to you more about that. It's a fascinating project, of course, and very much heralded. Justin G. Reid is the State Director of Community Initiatives at the Virginia Humanities. He's public historian and cross-sector leader in cultural heritage advocacy and philanthropy. He manages the General Assembly's African American Cultural Resources Task Force, and he's the co-founder of the Lemon Project, the College of William and Mary, on race, public history, and memory. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you for having me. I guess I just wanted to begin by stating that this history is so recent. I think we have the tendency to regard it as being something that's in the distant past. But I sit here today, as a quote unquote millennial, but I'm also the great grandson of enslaved Virginians. My mother's grandparents were born in slavery. And so when we think about oral history and the power of oral history, it is something that can be very recent and reliable in so many ways. I think a lot of my work around public memory and oral history began while a university student at William and Mary, which happens to be, it's the oldest institution of higher learning in the U.S. South. It's the second oldest university in the United States, and it also happens to be the seventh oldest university in the English-speaking world. So arriving to William Mary at the time that I did, we had a very proud history, but I don't believe it was a very honest history. Mm-hmm. And the Lemon Project was born out of student activism. I was one of those students who felt that as an institution, we could do better in acknowledging the past and acknowledging it honestly. And so it was born out of student activism. And today it continues, over a decade later, and has done incredible work, really connecting with the local community, specifically Black members of the community, with Black students and alumni, and really peeling back the layers of history so that we can have that more authentic narrative around the institution and our actual founders, the enslaved and indentured laborers at the College of William and Mary. But I also really want to emphasize that the Lemon Project was an initiative that came out of intergenerational dialogue, and I think that's a common thread that I see between the founding of that initiative, between public memory and oral history. At the time that I was at William and Mary, we had an intergenerational dialogue, or at least to us, it seemed intergenerational because as a freshman, when you come in as a first-year student, those upperclassmen, seem much older and wiser. And I had the benefit of being mentored by Tasimi Zagie and Rochelle Faithful, who over the course of their time at William and Mary began to push for honest reckoning with our history. And upon their graduation, handed the torch to me for me to continue. But it was also an intergenerational dialogue between student activists and our faculty mentors. Terry Myers, an English professor, had begun to uncover a lot of this early history. And he wasn't even a professor of mine, but he took the time out to mentor me and to meet with me and to have conversations with me in his office. And then Jody Allen, who was my advisor. Jody Allen today directs the Lemon Project, but she also invested so much time into me and was teaching me how to be a public historian and an oral historian. And so at the same time that I was learning from them and grappling with my own family history, as a student activist, we were able to push for some of the changes that we knew our mentors also wanted to see. And so it's the coming together of these mutual goals that I think was critically important for this work happening at William and Mary. And I think that's truly the power when we talk about oral history and public memory. It's this intergenerational communication, whether it's through the built environment, whether it's verbally, in many cases, non-verbally. Mm-hmm. We're inheriting so much from the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. Professor Alan Rice is a professor in English and American Studies at the University of Central Lancashire. He's the co-director of the Institute for Black Atlantic Research, director of the UCLan Lancashire Research Centre and Migration, Diaspora and Exile. He is the author of numerous works, and I would like to say I've actually been to Lancashire to do research on my own book, on my own family research of John Wales there at Preston. So it's wonderful to welcome you here. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Annette. I really wanted to start by saying that, in a sense, memory in Britain of slavery is almost an amnesia, a time of imperial melancholia, as Paul Gilroy puts it. There is so much forgotten. And yet this forgetfulness comes only 6 years after the final payment was made in compensation to the slave holders. Mm-hmm. So the 20 million, 17 billion in today's money, which went to the slave owners in Britain and its empire, has only just been paid back. How can we forget when the debt is so close? What I'd like to say is that we at the Institute for Black Atlantic Research, and through Labena Hamid, the Turner Prize winners, Making Histories Visible project, work on a range of different things to try and keep these memories alive, or even at times to try and push those memories to the forefront so that slavery does not get forgotten. And one of the ways that we do this is by working closely with local communities, with the Preston Black History Group, with the newly formed Lancaster Black History Group. Mm-hmm. And what the Lancaster Black History Group did was to say, this is not a moment, the moment of Black Lives Matter. This needs to become a movement. And they've set up a slave families project. And this project is not about the Black families in Lancaster as such. It's about the 7 prominent white families who were involved in the slave trade. And through them, we find the stories of their black enslaved servants, whose lives are virtually invisible. But what we're trying to do through this project and subsequent projects is to create portraits of these people, imagined portraits. So what I'd like to say about public memory and oral history is sometimes you have to be exceptionally creative to kind of reconstruct these histories. These histories aren't there for us to pluck from the archives easily. All we have in Lancaster are 49 baptismal records for these people. That's all we have, until suddenly in 2018, we found that some of the slaves had escaped, and they're in the adverts, escaped slave adverts in Britain. And one of them was an Igbo boy, and he was aged 14, and he had scarification marks on his face, and he spoke with a broad Lancashire dialect. And what I'd like to say, and the people in Lancaster Black History Group would like to say, he is ours as well as Africans. He's ours on the tip of his tongue. And one of the things we need to do is to kind of reconstruct people like him, their histories, however hard that is.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, now we're here all together. And I'd like to start just to ask throughout a question. And as I said, this is a round table. So if things occur to people, questions you want to ask to one another or to me or whatever, it's fine. But on this last point, when Alan, if I might call you Alan, was talking about how they do their work. If you could just, Andrew and Justin, expand upon that, because when we talk about oral history or public memory, but particularly oral history, I would think people in the audience and others might want to know, how do you do this? Historians, when I want to start writing about something, I go to the library. There are definite places where I can get started. So how does this work for you, Andrew and Justin, and the Lemon Project and getting word and those kinds of things? How do you get going with your projects?
If I could speak to the origins of getting word in 1993, it really begins with relationships. And Cinder Stanton and Diane Swan Wright knew that Monticello in particular had very difficult, disturbing relationships with local African Americans in Albemarle County. And when they began to look for descendants of people enslaved in Monticello, they knew that they needed to better these relationships. And when they identified descendants living in Southern Ohio, descendants of Madison Hemings, Sally Hemingses, and Thomas Jefferson's son, they had a relationship with a local historian there, Ms. Beverly Gray. And so everything here regarding the actual ethical practice of oral history involves making relationships, trusting one another, and embarking on what can be a really profound, meaningful process.
So again, sort of contrasting it, when you think of traditional historians, not only do you go to the library and you go through archives and so forth, it's sort of, you're by yourself to some degree until the point at which you come out and you want to show things to your colleagues and so forth. But you're saying this is a collaborative. Would you say it's quintessentially a collaborative effort?
Quintessentially collaborative. This is all about shared authority and entering into a dialogue, as Justin was describing earlier, between another individual, right, or groups of individuals. And so it involves a great deal of humility, I would say, to walk in and listen. And that's what we're doing. We're sitting at the feet of informants, of subjects who may never have been asked or have been purposely excluded or erased from the archive. And so our job is to expand the available pasts for remembering, as anthropologist David Scott says. And we do that through these conversations and recording these conversations. And now it's easier than ever to do that with smartphones, of course.
Justin?
Yeah, I thought Andrew summarized this work beautifully. And I think there are a lot of things that translate also for the Lemon Project as well. I mean, I would describe the Lemon Project more as a public memory project, with oral history being one component, there's been incredible work engaging members of the surrounding Williamsburg community that's connected to William and Mary, also interviewing Black alumni and their experiences at William and Mary. But as Andrew said, it really comes back to allowing the time for relationships to be developed and for that trust to be built. It's critical to be open to whatever the interviewee, right, is open to saying. And it may not even be what you intentionally thought you were seeking, and you have to follow whatever is shared with you in many different directions. But I think ultimately it comes down to this principle of being open and showing that openness and really showing interest in the willingness to listen.
Alan, do you have any more on this?
Yeah, I suppose what I'd say is that we're constructing the stories from what we have, and we don't have that unbroken chain to us of the descendants often. And that makes things much more difficult, but also maybe it allows is creative modes and means. So those stories can be told for other ways. So we have the Lancaster Sewing Cafe Lancaster are making constructing a banner or sewing a banner with the stories encoded in there that we found out as far as we found them out, as a means of kind of trying to tell that Black story which cannot be reconstructed from oral memoir. So I think that oral memoir is wonderful. We've been working or trying to work on a project with local Prestonian, Preston Black people, talking about Windrush coming to Britain before, and that's much easier, obviously. But we're talking a broken chain. The descendants here, then we don't have them in Lancaster. We have a Black community, but they're a newer Black community, and they want to find out about previous Black communities in Lancaster. So if you're in Liverpool, and Liverpool does wonderful things, it has a much older Black community, can do oral memoir in a very different way. Like Andrew and Justin have talked about.
So one thing you said when you were in your introductory remarks, you were talking about talking about the white families in Lancashire. What kind of resistance? And I'm going to ask this to all of you, but just as a general matter, what kind of resistance do you get to this, or do you get resistance to these kinds of efforts?
There's a gigantic resistance historically in Lancaster to talking about the story of the history of the city in terms of slavery. They want to talk about the beautiful furniture. Gillows is an amazing Waring and Gillows, beautiful, beautiful mahogany furniture, and people just don't want to talk about that. What created that? And these specific families, we've got local community historians, 40 of them, working from the age of 14 to 80 on those families. And we're in touch with some of the descendants. They want to frame the narrative, though, in their own way. So we think it's really important to engage with them, but not to allow them to frame the narrative. The narrative has to be framed by the community historians and the expert historians. But you have, they've got material which we don't have, which we need to get access to. So, but they really want to frame the narrative in ways that will allow their descendants off the hook often. And their descendants can't get off the hook. We've actually documented what involvement they had.
Well, that's a really delicate balance, it would seem, because this would be present, Andrew and Justin, in your work as well. Families, of course, have an image of themselves, right? They have a story they want to tell, and even if they're the descendants of enslaved people, they may have a perspective about that, about their family that may or may not be correct. I mean, and I certainly, in my work, encounter that sometimes, with people who have a vision of their family, and it sounds like you have to be a diplomat in some ways. I mean, you mentioned, Alan, that you need material from these people, but you can't tick them off too much because then they withdraw.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the midst of that at the moment. I don't want to comment too much specifically on it because we are in the midst of it at the moment. But we are in negotiations with descendants, some of the families, over heirlooms and things which would be really useful for our community historians to see.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to we want to be on that delicate line on the right side of it, but in both ways. We want to tell the full story, but we also don't want to alienate the families. So that's our problem, and I think that's the dilemma for anyone working with these kinds of issues. But we are not going to whitewash, and that's why I've set up a map and a slave trail, and we name all the families, and we name where they lived. We name the black servants, slave servants they had, and we name the profits they made and the ships they sent out. So that I developed a new version of that trail with much more black agency in it just last year.
Justin, do you encounter these issues? How do you handle these things?
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I have,
well, and I will say, because there's sort of a different perspective. He's talking about enslavers.
Yeah.
And for the most part, you're talking about people who are enslaved. And so both of them can have perspectives. I guess you could say that could there be a tendency to be less hardcore with the people who are descendants of enslaved than enslavers? I mean, is there a different way of viewing the material? Because he said, Alan, you said, you have to listen to them, as you suggested, Justin. But in the end, it has to be the historians who say, this is the historians who do the presentation.
Right. Well, both perspectives are valuable, right? Obviously, valuable in different ways. And I think, all of us who are trained in oral history, the methodology requires us to not interrupt, right? To ask open-ended questions, to try to reserve our opinion and to not interject and to really listen and listen intently. And I guess when I say listen, you're also listening for what's not said and kind of reading in between the lines. And to me, it's always fascinating. I mean, I guess when you're thinking about memory and history, in some ways, memory becomes more valuable because it's what people believe to be true. And you're exploring why they believe what they believe versus what may have actually happened, right? And so when I'm doing this work, I've become much more fascinated in the question of why a person has a certain memory or believes what they do, sometimes more than what actually happened, the actual history in many cases. And I think psychologically that gives you a window into so many kind of rationales and deeper level understandings for historical acts. And you can see how people have processed that history across time and how they've dealt with trauma, or how they've even erased certain memories in order to deal with trauma. And I think when you start getting into the psychological underpinnings of memory and why people are transmitting certain interpretations of history, you really are able to kind of dig deeper into some kind of human nature dilemmas when it comes to.
That's very tricky. I mean, that could be really painful for families. How do you? I mean, have you ever been brought up short? I mean, talking to people about things that are deeply personal and family, as you're saying, that shape family's understanding of itself. That's a huge responsibility. I mean, it's one thing if you're, again, in an archive looking at a book or reading people's letters and interpreting what they're doing, but you're face to face with people who may be, dealing or living with the results of trauma.
And I'm really curious to hear from Andrew on this, but I'll say, a lot of the oral history work that I've been involved with hasn't directly tackled the issue of slavery. I think slavery is often unspoken. So, if you're talking to, Black descendants, I'll use my, my grandmother as an example. She very vividly remembered her grandfather who helped raise her. He was born in slavery. she lived with him for a good part of her childhood and would constantly talk about him, but never once mention that he was enslaved. And so you're touching the subject, but not necessarily doing it directly. So I don't think people are necessarily communicating a lot of the trauma that they experience. I think, when we're gathering these oral histories, it's an attempt to, by the interviewees to share, some of the maybe best aspects of their family history, or the things that they're proud of, experiences that bring them the most joy. And again, I mentioned earlier, you kind of have to listen to the silences and the things that aren't being said. It's in those things that aren't being communicated that you find are usually connected to trauma.
Andrew?
Yeah, I was just thinking that we need to listen to the oral histories of descendants of enslavers as well, because oftentimes they may be on land that where Black people are buried, right, where ancestors are buried. There's a famous quote, there's oftentimes more Black history in white people's family Bibles than there is elsewhere. So we need to have these relationships, and they can be really challenging. I remember I was conducting an informational interview with a descendant of an enslaver in Alabama. These families are entangled, right? Black families and families of former enslavers are entangled. And this descendant of an enslaver had said to me off the record, but I won't share a name, but the descendant had said, what if they're lying in the oral history interviews, talking about descendants of enslaved people? And she was asking me about the very methodology of what we do and if we could even trust any type of oral history at all. And that gets to what Justin was asking about. Why would you think that they would need to lie, right? What is it about your own kind of psychological makeup that would lead you to ask if someone were lying about a particular historical event? And so what I try and do with these relationships is just say flat out that my only friend is truth. I'm just here to interpret the truth. And ultimately the truth will come out. And so those relationships can be really challenging. In my personal life, I have my grandmother's grandparents were enslaved. And I have tracked down 3 of the 4 enslaving families of her grandparents. And I've met individuals from each of those 3 families. And those are really trying conversations. But what I say is, I'm not here for anything except for information and to say that we're here. And my only friend, again, is truth. And I want to know that our oral history is confirmed and confirmable. And I would like to establish a relationship because I would like to know how you have remembered as well.
And what do they say? You said that they're difficult. What is the, how does that express itself? The difficulty. I mean, just is it just in their manner, in their what they're willing to share and not share? How?
I think it's difficult because it can be so emotional, right? But so far, I've had successful personal relationships with a handful of the people that I've met from these families. So it can be difficult, but it can be overcome, right? And to connect, and that's what we're here for: to learn the truth, to connect with one another, and move forward.
Do you find Alan? You were going to say something?
No.
No. I was going to say, do you find that there's not resistance, not just resistance in terms of particular issues, families who may be embarrassed or concerned about their ancestors' involvement in slavery or other kinds of practices? Is there resistance to oral history? How do people, do people look askance at it in some way? Has it been your experience that people think that it's somehow not, how do they know they're telling the truth? Well, how do you know that historians are telling the truth? Do you see oral history as treated as something less than traditional type of history? And has that changed over time?
I've definitely seen oral history become more valued in recent years. And I think, when we talk about, these movements around decolonization and looking at, how we do historical research, I think there's much more criticism directed towards some of the documentary evidence. I think, right? There are instances where we can use the oral history to get to the truth more than we can, use the written records that have been left behind and curated or edited. And I think, when we combine these two resources together, then I think, as Andrew says, we can get to that deeper level truth. I tend to not discredit oral history because, as I was trying to say earlier, to me, it's almost more important to know, what a person believes to be true, to see, because that's shaping their everyday life and their perception of themselves more than the actual history. And so I've definitely sensed a shift. I mean, we see it in I guess the graduate programs that are now being developed, that are focusing more on oral history methodologies and training. I feel as if when we think about the global South and non-white communities and the descendants of enslaved peoples here in the U.S., that oral tradition in many cases is all that we have. And so when we say that it's less than, or it doesn't mean as much, or isn't as valuable, we're also kind of indirectly devaluing the descendants themselves who carry and cherish that tradition and memory.
Yeah, I just like to say, I mean, my grandfather didn't read and write, and I got together his oral history, and that oral history is being used by people who breed Arab horses because he became an Arab groom all over the world now. They loved his stories, and those stories can tell them about things they wouldn't know beforehand. So there are ways in which these forms of knowledge go across loads of different ways. And what I'd like to say really is that actually I think there's a third thing. I think there's oral histories. I think there are histories based on archives, and I think there's the imagination and creativity. And I actually think that artists and writers can get to the truth of things sometimes as well. And that's why I work very closely with artists and writers, especially the artist Jade Montserrat. And she lives in Newcastle, and she's a black woman there, so not Newcastle, in Scarborough, in the northeast of England. And she lives there, but there isn't a large black community there. And her artwork is about trying to connect with the land and the earth. So she uses that to start saying, I belong here, to start thinking about there having been black people there before. Not that she's separated from them in so many ways, and she uses her artwork to try and connect with them. Labana Hamid, the Turner Prize winner, did a piece of work called Swallow Hard, the Lancaster Dinner Service, where she had portraits of black slave servants on beautiful 18th century plates. So she overpainted those portraits. She said, I've tried to imagine the lives of the almost invisible slave servants. These men bought from the plantations to work in quiet isolation in this chilly place. They look for clues, connections, ghosts, heroes. So I'm trying to say is actually, I think if we had a tripartite look at this, it actually took universal, took took other black artists from all over the diaspora, music, Julian, can allow them to tell us a truth which rests alongside the historical truth. We might get them to a kind of a space and a place where we can see these things in around. So I'd say yes, oral history, yes, public memory, yes, this kind of archival history, all are important. But the problem is, if you elevate one of these up above the others, there's a real problem. We need to use them all, but we also need to use our creative imaginers too.
Andrew?
Yeah, that's right. I think oral history should be given equal weight as every other historical source, and it should not be devalued. And the recent kind of upsurge of interest and the legitimacy of oral history is determined because we recognize it now to be just as legitimate a source as any other historical source. And I'll tell a brief story, and I shared this with Justin the other day and Professor Gordon-Reed. I'm sure you know it because it deals with a white descendant of a family in Chillicothe, Ohio, just outside, actually right where Madison Hemings had lived. And in the late 90s, this man, Ray Malone, and he's featured on the Getting Word website, he gave an interview to Getting Word, and his great-great-uncle was a neighbor of Madison Hemings. And what had come down in that white family was that all Thomas Jefferson's papers in the world, combined with all of the papers of every Philadelphia lawyer in the world, meant nothing compared to Madison Hemings's work. Mm-hmm. Every piece of paper that Jefferson had, all 19,000 letters that we have, was nothing really. It didn't have the same kind of weight as Madison Hemings's words, because his word was his bond. And to Justin's point earlier about curation, right? Jefferson obviously selectively edited and curated many aspects of his personality and his life, but his son did not, right? What his son said in 1873 to a newspaper reporter remained the truth. And we can see, if we were to do a side-by-side analysis of Jefferson's papers, right, and Madison Hemings's words, just in a couple hundred-word newspaper article, we will see, like Ray Malone said, that all the paper in the world doesn't come up to Madison Hemings's words.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and Justin, you were going to say something? Well,
I wanted to kind of add something to what Alan stated. I mean, he talked about, I guess, the creative and performing arts, and oral history being one leg, and then we have archival research being another leg. And I think we'd be remiss if we also didn't recognize, I think, the incredible work that's happening in the sciences that also connect back to history. We've seen so many strides in recent years around epigenetics. And, when we talk about DNA research and being able to look at behavioral sciences, I think there's a fourth leg to this. I mean, there's a public memory that is not verbal and is not written, and it appears in how we occupy space and how we move through the world. It appears in the things, in the mannerisms that we inherited unconsciously. I think there's a fourth way that history and public memory, right, is manifesting itself, and it comes in, I think, often more subtle ways. And I think of a recent example of descendants of enslaved people who are reunited. These are relatives who have reunited because of these advances in DNA research, and they're coming together and recognizing that, having never met before, there are still similarities, in how they communicate, or in certain foods, or things that they do with their family. They're seeing it in branches of their family they never met before. And I think, even from my own experience, having grown up in a predominantly Black rural space, when I attended university, I saw, very kind of distinct kind of cultural parallels in my friends who were West African and my friends who were West Indian. Mm-hmm. And I think, these are things that are also part of our memory and our inheritance of memory that, can't necessarily be articulated verbally, but you can either discern from scientific research or from the behavioral science.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the fascinating thing about all of this. Even in my own work, thinking about recovering stories that are, as I said, started out not told. You have to use everything.
That's right.
It's not enough to just go and look at letters and say, this is what he said and this is what she said, and then that's it. You're recreating. You couldn't do that in your own life. I mean, if you wanted to tell the story, if you wanted to compile all of the, Facebook posts or letters or emails that people write, there would still be a huge amount of most of the person's lives lived outside of that. And there have to be ways to get at that. And what you guys are talking about, what you were describing today, is the way to try to tap into that. Oral history, the archive, the oral history works with the archive, because one of the things you do when you said that when people are telling a story that they want to believe versus one that's the may more likely true. You know that because you've gone some other place and you've corroborated what they're saying. You can look outside of that. And so you do think, well, why is this particular story being told, which is a story in itself versus the thing that you may have been pursuing. But there are ways to look at all of this from an artistic standpoint, from the archive, from use whatever tools are available. Science, obviously, our very bodies tell a story about who we are and to whom we're related. And that opens up a lot. What do you think about the politicization of all of this? I mean, history has become really, I don't know if this has happened in the UK, but yeah, I guess everywhere. How does that relate to what you do? Does it make it more difficult?
Yeah, can I just speak to Britain, because you asked me specifically? We have a really difficult moment at the moment where historians are being traduced for bringing slavery up by a very right-wing government. If we bring it into the conversation, we're told that we're woke, that that it shouldn't be brought up in the conversations around these aristocratic families and around their houses, that we should not be doing this, and that it actually is cancelling. They talk about it cancelling history. Mm-hmm. And we need to fight back against this, but we only fight back against it by using these specific tools. We can't fight back against it purely in rhetoric. We fight back against it with these many tools that we have as cultural historians. Mm-hmm. And I think that I don't want to go on to a TV debate with someone and just kind of shout across at them. I like to go onto a TV debate with a kind of sheath of papers that I could just say, well, there's this, there's that. And basically, our armor as public historians is the work we've done. And the problem is that those who attack us don't need to do any work. They just you need to use words like woke and cancel and shout. Mm-hmm. And we've got to try and keep very calm and say, here is the work. Here is the work.
Okay.
I was thinking that it shows how important are the stakes that politicians are really paying attention to what's going on in the historical field, right? I came across a quote just yesterday given to me by a colleague, Steve Light at Monticello. It's a Tony Judd quote, and if I can read it, because I just wrote it down and put it on my wall for safekeeping. Tony Judd says, the historian's task is not to disrupt for the sake of it, but it is to tell what is almost always an uncomfortable story and explain why the discomfort is part of the truth we need to live well and live properly. A well-organized society is one in which we know the truths about ourselves collectively, not one in which we will tell pleasant lies about ourselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I try and keep that in mind. Ever since I learned it just yesterday, I will always try to keep it in mind.
Well, it's a very interesting time. I mean, history has come to, even the so-called traditional history has come under attack. And we're in a moment when people seem, really hell-bent on going after historians for telling stories that, as you say, that are unpleasant. And I just wondered have you thought about how it might, Justin, have you thought about how that might change what you do or not?
And I guess, we're all connected to public humanities in different ways. And it's definitely at the forefront of our mind at the organization that I work for, Virginia Humanities. We're one of 56 state humanities councils. And I think all of these state humanities councils are grappling with, our charge to, foster empathy and connection and understanding, and the backlash that we're seeing across the country. It's shaping the work that I do, and the work that I call, and the work that my colleagues do is impacting what we do, and I believe it's only making us want to do more. And is motivating us to do more. I don't think we've ever been an organization, that's been interested in myth making and like fictionalizing of history. We've always been in pursuit of the truth and more truth. And I think the backlash, that we're witnessing in specifically about the United States, is that we're really, for the first time, I think, in our existence as a nation, being exposed to more perspectives of history that are challenging the myths, right, that have been inherited across time. So I think one of the things that I've been kind of really interested in doing, I guess because of this political backlash, is really helping kind of the general public make that distinction between history and memory and heritage and myth. I mean, these are all different things that sometimes become conflated. And so we can recognize that the story that you've inherited, the myth perhaps that your family told you about, this country, kind of is in direct conflict with the documentary evidence, with some of the scientific research that exists, and with the oral histories from this huge swath of the nation that you previously never listened to. Yeah. So now what do we do with that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, that's, I mean, the last part. I mean, what you said, particularly the last part of it, is critical. That we're now hearing from people. We're using a form to hear from people that we haven't heard from before, whether it's referencing public memory, whether it's through art, whether it's through oral history. We're now hearing the voices of people and the perspectives of people who didn't write things down and write books and what we've been focusing on for so much of in the past. This has been a great conversation. Now, I'd like to bring the audience into this right now. Maria Vorel, as people from past generation to generation, stories evolve with the people. How do you think about the factual accuracy of the stories? Does it matter? I guess she's saying this, this is a gigantic game of telephone here. How do you assess the accuracy of these things, and does accuracy matter?
I'm trying to make eye contact with Andrew, but I'll share my opinion, and I believe that kind of the accuracy does not matter. Again, it's more important to simply know what's been transmitted, why it's been transmitted, and what people believe to be true. In many cases, that's more important than trying to discern the accuracy. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Andrew.
I think accuracy and the transmission and why it was transmitted are equally important. There's a story in the Getting Word archive about Tarleton's raid on Charlottesville and on Monticello in particular. And the story is passed down in the Black family, who's descended from Jupiter Evans, Thomas Jefferson's enslaved manservant. And the same story has also been passed down through Jefferson's white descendants. And the story is that Jupiter, or his brother, hid the family silver beneath the porch in basically a cubbyhole when the British were coming. And so when white informants are asked about that story or to relate that story, when they do so, they relate the story as one in which to illustrate the loyalty of the enslaved people to the Jefferson family, that the enslaved people would go through the lengths of hiding the family silver so that way it could be safe kept. When the Black people tell that story, the descendants of Jupiter or Caesar, they're telling that story not because it demonstrates the loyalty to the family, but because it demonstrates that, well, they're trying to save themselves, and just in case the British did in the United States, then they might also come out with something and have the silver for themselves, right? So I'm very interested to know why stories are being transmitted, as Justin said, but also the accuracy, of course, matters too for me.
Mm-hmm. Alan?
Yeah, I agree totally with Andrew. I suppose the only thing I'd say is that we just have to be very, very careful when we're transmitting the oral histories, that we negotiate them and we use them in ways that don't kind of make them as this is the only way in which this can be seen or said. There is multiplicity to these stories. always multiple perspectives.
Yeah. Well, I think, for me, to contribute to this, I would say that accuracy matters and the story itself matters. Why these people are telling this story, and you tell both of them. You can say, it's true that because some of the stories that are told, we know can't be right because we know this person, their ancestor whom they're referring to, wasn't born then, or wasn't there then. So the story is important, figuring out why they're telling the story. But you can also say, well, this is what we know from other kinds of information. So it's not either or. It's that here's what was said. It's important to have that relayed, but also to put it in the context. If you have other information that tells a more quote accurate story of it, that goes with it as well. It's about putting them together.
Yeah, and I want to amend my response a little bit too, because I guess I am in agreement with everyone, and I'm thinking now oral history is valuable regardless of whether or not it's true or not. There's still inherent value in just what's being communicated, and then trying to parse through why it's being communicated. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about oral history is that it creates research questions. For those of us
absolutely
who are conducting oral history interviews, and we're able to then use that to guide where we're looking for answers and context, right? I can think of many different examples where an oral history has kind of redirected.
Absolutely. What you guys are describing, what we're talking about here in some ways is detective work. And if you like that kind of thing, and I do, and I suppose we all do, it's a wonderful way it's a starting point to answer questions. Well, why does the person think this? And very often there's something, it's like the people in Southern Africa who claimed descent from Jewish people, that they were part Jewish, and people can't figure out, what is the story here? Why are these people telling the story about Cohen and them being a part of all of this? And it turns out, you mentioned before DNA testing, that there are connections here. And so you don't know how it happened, but the fact that they're telling a story and getting some things right and some things wrong means that there's something there. And that's a fertile ground for you to go to discuss these things. I'll go to another question. Sherry Huerta, what are some of the ways you curate or balance the private nature of memories and stories with or into a public-facing interpretation? So once you've heard these stories, how does it get to, how do you create a public-facing interpretation of it, one that makes sense?
You ask permission, right? So we establish the relationships, we engage with one another, we listen to one another, we record an oral history interview if that is something that we want to happen. We archive that interview, and we ask permission from the informant to then potentially use their information or their stories in public-facing interpretation. So we would never do that otherwise.
Okay. We'll do one more question. This is for all the panelists. Do you think that oral history techniques will be used by historians more frequently now, especially to document events that are still fresh? The 2016 election, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I think that they're going to come to the fore. When you think about activists and the amount of things they have to say, and the amount of things that need to be said about, well, in Britain, that amazing moment of Black Lives Matter following on from the American moment, it's a different moment, and it's a moment that needs its own interpretation. And the people who were involved were often very new to politics, exceptionally new to politics, and they'll have very new things to say. In Lancaster, where I live, people stood up for the first time in a open public demonstration and spoke out. And we in Lancaster Black History Group are gathering together those kinds of oral narratives, but also taking them not just to talk about that moment, but changing them into a movement. So kind of thinking about those narratives and making something of them, which is why we started this project to look at Lancaster's Black history, because the people who started to speak up then said, well, why don't I know about this history? And they don't know about it because it wasn't there nearly enough for them when they went through school and things. So yeah, I think that it's a moment when we're going to have a lot more of those, more oral history here in Britain, at least, of that movement.
Do you guys agree?
I do. It's easier than ever to record voices, and we should be doing that. And I think not just for recent events, the 2016 election or the pandemic or Black Lives Matter, but also in this moment to capture as many of voices of our elders as we possibly can in our family conversations. Ask permission and record digitally the voice of your grandmother or grandfather. I think we have the opportunity and the technology to do so, so let's take advantage of that.
Justin, I'll give you the last word.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I 100% agree, and I think there's so many resources that can help us become better oral historians, even if you've never participated in a formal academic training program. I think obviously the most important thing is to make sure you hit record.
That's right.
Yeah.
I suppose the other thing is that we can communicate across geographical boundaries now. So our activists here had a discussion with activists in Bremen live on a podcast. It's the Urban Political Podcast, and so that's recorded for posterity now. And I think there's a lot of those kinds of interactions going on, which will be really useful for the historians of the future.
Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you all for participating in it and for the audience questions. This is a great way to close out this symposium with people becoming their own historians in ways, understanding that we're all a part of history. Right. And we have ways to contribute. So thank you guys very much. And I hope to see you in person soon someday. Thank you.
Thank you.